I'm Roy Peters, State Director of Vocational Technical Education in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's vocational education system has a rich history. Books have been written about Oklahoma Votech. Hundreds of magazine and journal articles have been published. But in 1995, we decided to record some of this rich history by way of a panel which was convened to discuss the Oklahoma vocational technical education system. The panelists are people who were involved in the history through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even part of the 90s. Moderating the panel was Dr. Leo Presley. Leo was named director of the Oklahoma Department of Commerce shortly after the recording of this video in 1995.
The panel consists of Dr. Tuttle, who served as the state director for vocational education from 1967 through 1985, his deputy director for the majority of those years, Dr. Arch Alexander, and a gentleman by the name of Mr. Larry Hansen, who served as the coordinator and director of the Area Schools Division, which is the major delivery arm for certainly the economic development and industry training side of vocational education. The panel conversation was set in the context of a very informal atmosphere. We simply had the three panel members and myself sitting around a table and just talking about that period of time and the stories as they remembered them, the events, the way they played out, and some of the key players in the state, Governor Bartlett and different players, the different governors, the different political leaders, and the impact they had in influencing vocational education as well. Because Dr. Tuttle started his administration in 1966, we start in 1966 timeframe.
He was very much interested in economic development. And he had done enough study of what was going on in the United States. And he heard about South Carolina and went there and visited. And came back liking what he saw, because South Carolina was not the first state to build area Votech schools, but it was the first state to use vocational education to primarily help economic development. Well, that was basically their purpose. And they had a director of what they called the Technical Education Committee. The Tech Committee. And they built 13 schools under the auspices of that committee. And they got the legislature behind them. And so these 13 schools were created. But the unique thing about those schools was the way they worked with industry, and they used those schools to help them seek industry. And so knowing that, Governor Bartlett asked for a study of the vocational training system in Oklahoma. And they hired a firm called Ling Temco Vaught. LTV. With the understanding that they would get the South Carolina people over here to make the study. So the director from South Carolina was the director of the study. For all practical purposes. LTV had a person up here, but the director from South Carolina really was the director of the study. Anyway, Art can tell you one of the conclusions of the study was that the people's opinion of vocational education was neither good or bad. It was non-existent.
The people in Oklahoma. Yeah.
And that hurt her feelings quite a bit. And so we, I think, sort of pledged to ourselves that we were going to do something about it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, after the study, and Governor Bartlett decided that I was the guy that he wanted to do the leadership of building a kind of vocational training program.
Now let me just clarify something there, because that's an interesting little insight of information. That if that's the decision that Governor Bartlett made, then that may be the pinnacle decision that actually put the area Vo-Tech school and the emphasis with vocational education as opposed to under the higher regents in the state of Oklahoma. Would that be correct?
That's probably correct. One of the important things was that the general who was commander at Tinker Air Force Base began to make a lot of noise about Oklahoma not training anybody. And since Tinker was a maintenance base and needed trained personnel, why, they just couldn't do a very good job, or couldn't do the kind of job they were supposed to do because of that. And he and the governor made a deal to take a whole group of people from Oklahoma to South Carolina to visit.
The infamous trip to South Carolina.
Yeah.
And all the people that claimed to have been on that airplane.
Yes. There weren't a lot of people in vocational education that made the trip, or education, for that matter. Most of the people that made the trip was represented the financial industry, represented newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, that kind of people, kind of the power structure.
Well, was the people that made this trip, were they there basically by invitation of Governor Bartlett? Was he the one that drove the list of those who got to go?
He developed the list of who was to be invited.
And so he put the power brokers on the airplane.
Right.
But it's kind of interesting that, I mean, just from that standpoint, that the commander of the military base would get that involved in the infrastructure from Oklahoma's educational standpoint.
That's right.
Yeah.
And,
well, he said he was hiring people, though, that weren't really qualified to do the technical work on the aircraft that were being repaired at Tinker. That was his interest.
So they were going to have to train everybody that's going to work out there, and he didn't think that was their responsibility. The state ought to do that.
Well, the other thing that's interesting to me that's kind of evolving here is that the infamous 1969 trip or 8 trip to South Carolina, I have always heard told was the impetus to the Special Schools Division for Industry Training. But what I'm hearing here is that really was much more paramount and fundamental to the creation of the area of Vo-Tech schools as we know it than simply the industry training aspect of vocational education.
Well, the industry training aspect was in the forefront of it, but it went together with the total system that South Carolina had developed. We visited a couple of schools, and we were told how the special schools, what they call special schools, was the training for the initial employees of industries that either came to South Carolina or was mounting some growth for South Carolina.
I want to establish what I think I'm hearing here is that, yes, we had the Vocational Education Act of 1963, which was the impetus for the creation of area schools. Those first 5 we created were area schools that were in conjunction with a public school system. That was the Oklahoma City and the Tulsa and the Enid and the Duncan and the Ardmore.
Duncan.
But the area voc school as we know it in Oklahoma today was really driven more by the emphasis of Dewey Bartlett as an economic development tool and industry recruitment than, so to speak, the creation of an area voc school infrastructure for education purposes.
Well, sort of.
A little strong?
No, there were other factors.
Okay.
The other factors were that the schools, those first 5 schools, our state board made the decision that they wouldn't approve a school anyplace unless they built a new building.
Okay.
Because our experience was that the superintendents would all of them wanted a school, but they wanted it, and they wanted to put it in an old abandoned warehouse.
The old shed out back.
Or the old school where they had built a new one.
Right.
And that sort of thing. So I think the state board made a good decision there. But despite all that, it soon became evident that those schools weren't going to work very well because the public schools, their priorities were not on vocational education. And they didn't have the money. And their priority wasn't for that, so they didn't even want to spend a share of the money. And so we soon decided that we had to have some other way to fund vocational education or it wasn't going to work. And that resulted in the constitutional amendment giving us the right to form districts. People passed that, and that's gives us the right to form a VOTEC district, gives a state board. It also creates a separate board for vocational. It didn't, but at the same time there was the authorization creating a separate board. And that, to me, that was the real thing that made it work. We were able to form a district, and we were able to vote millage to help fund the program. Taking that with the amount of federal and state funds that we were able to get, which back at that time was deemed to be about 50-50. We used 50% local and about 50% state and federal money to fund those first schools. Anyway, without that, Oklahoma would still be in the dark ages as far as vocational education is concerned, in my opinion.
Yeah, the constitutional amendment, did that come under, was Bartlett in office then, or was that Bellman that did that?
That was Bartlett.
That was under Bartlett, so he pushed that constitutional, Larry?
I don't think so. I think, see, Bartlett and Murphy were trying to compose this bill, and Dr. Hodge, I think, took over you, and Hamilton and the other man, Eastern Oklahoma, became the eventual authors. But I think that constitutional amendment was in 1966, and Bartlett took office as governor in 1967.
So it was the end of Bellman's term, the beginning of Bartlett's term when he took it.
Yeah,
That's true.
It really was not the responsibility so much of a governor, because a governor can't even veto a constitutional amendment that is passed by the House and Senate. Goes directly to the people for a vote.
Right.
He has something to do with calling the vote, but and that's true. That's what the situation was.
I'll mention one thing first, though. I think Dr. Tuttle's being a little bit modest about the way the area schools came about. He had his vision of what they should be like and how they should be organized, and he also knew that the industry leaders in Oklahoma wanted this special industry training, and he was able to put those two things together, and that prompted, I think, the way that Oklahoma's area VOTEC schools took off.
The ability to orchestrate
That's right,
both of those.
because he got what he wanted, they got what they wanted, And I think it's been a good arrangement ever since.
One of the things, Arch, that you had said earlier, and I wanted to go back and touch on, because it's a question people have asked me before, Dr. Tuttle, and as I visited with different people about the system, and they said, you know, back in 65, 66, 67, whenever it was, do you think that Dr. Tuttle, at that point in time, had envisioned that in 1995 the area tech schools would look like they do now, would be as massive as they are now, and as much of a factor? And I've always said, well, I don't know, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say, yes, he did have a vision like that. So now I'm going to ask you yourself, with the question that I've been asked on a number of occasions, in 65, 66, 67, those early days, did you at that time have in your mind a vision about someday the state of Oklahoma would have 29 area tech school districts, and they would be as politically and economically powerful a player as they are in the Oklahoma horizon today?
Well, not exactly that way. Partially that way. For example, we made a study in the state and divided the state up, and thought we would build 17 area tech schools. That we could handle it by building 17 schools. Well, that doesn't work. One of the sponsors that helped us get the constitutional amendment across used his influence with the state board to come and get them to disallow those 17. And he didn't want to be forced into a VOTEC district. We had to back up, and whenever an area was interested, we had to set up what the minimum criteria for forming a VOTEC district would be. And it was little enough, really. The truth of the matter is that might have been a good thing for us, because it made the people feel like, well, you know, we can do this. And if we do it, we'll get ahead of this area of the state over here. And so that started happening all over the state. And as that increased, it made most of the communities want to be either form a district or be a part of one. And we still have some area in the state that's not a part of a district. But I'd say about 96% of the population is in a VOTEC district now. So instead of 17 districts, we've got what now? 29. 29, I believe.
The number. And the essence of it is really, and I think you hit it, was that with the senator and the school superintendent from down in the southeastern part of the state coming to the board and getting the policy rescinded, because he didn't want to be forced into one, took what was going to be, probably looking back on it, a top-down superimposed structure from the state level, and made it a bottom-up driven, community-based system.
That's correct.
That's now encompassed the state and has 29 of them instead of 17.
While everybody walked around and thought, well, it really set us back, as I look back on it, I think probably is the best way to go.
Yeah.
And we have some area that's still not a part, and some people say, well, that isn't fair, but it's not too far from being fair.
Yeah.
What about?
And I know, Dr. Tuttle, early on, when you put the emphasis on adult education, even out of the State Department, you created a separate division, as opposed to having adult education being a natural extension of the occupational divisions. Tell us a little bit about your administrative decision there and the importance of that.
Well, everything that we tried to do, supporting industry and adult education, it was difficult to sell that philosophy even to the administrators of the VOTEC schools. For example, I was able to get enough money in the VOTEC school budget for each one of them to employ an industrial coordinator. Well, you'd be surprised at how many of the schools, they took the money and they hired somebody, but they chained them to the desk. They didn't want them out in the community running around talking to industry people. And I had to go as far as even rescinding that position to some schools to get them to ever wake up and use the person right. There probably was some never did use them right. Among educators, it was so difficult to get them to develop a different philosophy than what they had experienced in going to the public school. One of the problems that we had was Dr. Hodge opposed and almost would not allow us to set up a criteria that wouldn't allow a public school administrator to take a job in a vocational school. And some of the public school administrators that we used, I knew most of them. And I thought they'd do a good job. And they did do a good job of administering the school. But they didn't do a good job of thinking, of really projecting what they could become, of working with the industry. Found out that a lot of those administrators really were intimidated about going and talking to business people. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of the business people was intimidated about talking to educators. And so it took some training on the part of both, really, to make that fit together. Getting back to the idea of public school administrators being good area school administrators is not necessarily true. It isn't true today either, not necessarily. Because I used to tell them, well, you've got to drop the concept that here I've got this fine school and I will open up that school at night, but I want the same teacher that taught in the daytime to teach in that program at night, because I don't want somebody else coming in there and messing up his shop. And that was one of the hardest things that we had to do to break that concept amongst those guys. The thought was that, you know, I'm going to run a really good school from 9 to 4.
Yeah.
And I'll have some programs at night because state wants me to, not because I want to. And they had the same kind of program at night as they had in daytime. And adults got tired of that. Now, that wasn't what they wanted. And so the adult classes weren't that good. And they soon said, well, we don't want that. Well, it took, you know, some leadership on the part of some of those early superintendents to break loose from that concept and really start moving the adult programs. And then the other schools began to see, well, hey, you know, maybe that does work. And most of them came along, although some came by screaming and hollering and dragging their feet.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think, what is the secret, or what was the key to Oklahoma's being so successful and having such a national and international reputation as the premier model for a technical education system in the state?
Go ahead, go first, Larry.
Well, I think it boils down to people, really, and here I think Dr. Tuttle has provided tremendous leadership. He's kind of an individual that meets people well, and he has what I would probably say a more of a low-key approach that is more acceptable, particularly amongst the politicians and others. That he has a lot of influence, and Dr. Alexander's been around and with him on a lot of these situations, and I think the fact that they were heading up the state programs, they exuded confidence, a degree of people being comfortable with them, and I think whenever we had visitors here, that we treated them pretty well. We didn't set them aside to, and maybe bring in someone to take care of them that didn't quite know, the whole story. We always treated visitors. I think we put our best foot forward, and they put competent people with them that could tell the whole VOTEC story. And I think that this kind of bloomed, statewide, and then got across the state borders.
Yeah.
But I think having the right people in the right place is the major key to the success.
One of the things that I always felt that was important, and hear the story. I talked to the area school superintendents, and I'd give them a chance to comment on what we were thinking in terms of the budget. I met with different, elements of vocational education, and found out what was important to them. I didn't always go along with them, but I gave them an opportunity to be heard. I think that's important. And part of the time, you'll learn something by listening to them. And I think that's important. If a group ever gets to thinking that the state director doesn't want to hear them, then they're going to be against him. Mm-hmm. It's just that simple. If I'm the area school director over at Timbuktu, and the state director won't listen to me because I think I'm pretty important, then I don't have much use for him. Mm-hmm. So I think that that was important, to take the time to listen to those different groups. And generally speaking, when they have a chance to speak out, and sometimes you can say, yeah, but look, here's the effect of that. Or you can say, I've already been given the word by the governor that he'll oppose anything more than this amount. Now, do we want to fight the governor? And generally they'd say no, but I think that that's very important. I think that it's important to continue to build confidence with the legislators. Mm-hmm. And all of them like me, particularly, but I think they all thought I was honest with them. and that whatever I told them, they could depend on it.